We are excited that over 190 people signed up for today's webinar. It's great to see so much interest in this topic. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping issues. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll post the recording along with the slides on our website next week, so feel free to check back for that. And right now, all webinar attendees are muted. If you have any questions, you can submit them online in the chat box, and I will raise them for our panelists. So let's go ahead and take a look at our agenda. I'll start with a brief introduction to C2ES so you can understand where we're coming from on this topic, why we're interested in it, and then I'll introduce our panelists. We'll have presentations about private activity bonds in different contexts. We'll start off with an overview. We'll talk about how they're used in the transportation sector, how can they be used in the electricity and industrial sectors, and then we will have an interactive discussion session, and that's when, if you have any questions, we can discuss them. If you happen to have clarifying questions about any of the presentations, feel free to go ahead and type them in, and I can ask the panelists after each presentation. But for those kind of general discussion questions, we'll have those at the end. So let me begin by saying a few words about C2ES. We are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We have three goals. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, expand clean energy deployment, and boost resilience to climate impacts. And those three goals have a lot to do with infrastructure and investments in infrastructure, and that's why we're interested in today's topics. We also have a lot of publications. They're all available for free on our website, so I recommend that you check them out, c2es.org. We also have a Business Environmental Leadership Council, and as you can see on the slide here, the companies are mostly Fortune 100 companies. They come from different sectors of the economy, and so when we talk about reducing emissions and boosting resilience to climate impacts and climate policy, we're able to have a really comprehensive conversation. And today's program is part of a long-running effort that we call the Solutions Forum. And what we try to do is we bring together businesses, states, and cities to focus on a few areas. One is market-based strategies on reducing emissions. Another is mobilizing innovative finance mechanisms, and that's the connection to today's topic on private activity bonds and boosting communities' resilience to climate impacts. And we'd like to thank our sponsors for their support of the Solutions Forum. So thank you to the Energy Foundation, the JPB Foundation, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. With that, I just want to say a few words about our panelists. I really appreciate that they made time to join us on this webinar. Jeff Brown is a research fellow at the Stanford Steyer-Taylor Center and a lecturer at the Law and Business Schools at Stanford. Marla Lien is a partner at Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell, and she was the general counsel for the Regional Transportation District in the Denver area from 2005 to 2016. Patrick Orth is a legislative assistant to Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, and he previously was the director of federal affairs for America's Natural Gas Alliance. So we have a wealth of expertise in different disciplines here. And with that, let me hand it over to Jeff Brown to kick us off.
All right, well, thank you, Fatima, and I appreciate the chance to talk to everybody about how you use private activity bonds in big capital projects. And maybe you could go to the next one, Fatima. So whenever you start talking about detailed financial questions, you lose about 90% of your audience in 30 seconds, so this is why you should care. A typical decarbonization project, and that could be mass transit, could be some kind of low carbon power project, is characterized by high upfront investment and low annual costs. A light rail line has huge upfront costs and pretty low operating costs, as opposed to shuttle buses that don't cost much but have big diesel and labor. Same geothermal plant, huge upfront costs, not much after that, as opposed to a natural gas plant. Small upfront costs, but big running costs. So the decarbonization projects typically have huge capital costs. So the second bullet point, if you can figure out how to knock down the annual payments that the project has to make with respect to its initial capital, its mortgage payment or its return to equity, you drastically reduce the cost to users. So what are the big drivers of cost of money? Really, how long do you have to pay back the debt? A 5-year mortgage costs you more per year than a 30. The interest rate on the debt, the lower the better. And if there's a mix of debt and equity in a project, stockholders' money and borrowed money, the borrowed money is always cheaper, and the borrowed money can be deducted from taxes. So you'd always rather have more debt and less equity. It's called leverage. Well, if you can get it, the U.S. tax-exempt market is unique worldwide in terms of being really flexible in terms of how long to pay back the debt, the interest rate, and how much debt you can use. It's a giant market, $4 trillion outstanding, and very liquid, typically 300 or 400 million a year of bonds being issued. So that would be a great thing to use for a decarbonization project, but typically only government-owned projects can tap the market. You can tap the market to build a sewer system in your city or a new library, but you can't use it to build a McDonald's. There are certain special exceptions called private activity bonds where Congress will let a private entity benefit from this market, but they're rare. And we'll talk about that. So if a decarbonization project can gain access to PABs, private activity bonds, well, it can do one of two things, either of which is great. One, it can raise more money with the same income stream. Or, if it's in a competitive market for its services, if it can use private activity bonds to finance, it has a smaller mortgage payment, so it doesn't have to charge as much for service. So next. So what are they? So private activity bonds, they're governed by Section 142 of the tax code, for those of you who want to look. And they're really issued for three kinds of capital projects, all of which have a private non-governmental aspect. And they all get lumped into this one section. The third type here are the ones of interest to us. They're mortgage bonds, single-family mortgage bonds to have subsidized loans so that people can acquire homes, seaport and airport bonds. The property has to be owned by governments, but typically there's such long leases, say for a container port, that they might as well be private, and therefore they use these. The third one is the most interesting. It's types of capital projects. They're owned by private parties. They're used by private parties, and they're repaid by contracts with private parties, typically. But they're for a purpose thought to be so beneficial to the general public that Congress singled them out for special treatment and let them have access to this unique market. Next. So in this third category of, if you really wanted to call it private activity bonds, you have industrial water supply projects, industrial sewage treatment, solid waste disposal facilities, which is actually a huge category. This is everything from landfills to waste handling at power plants. Things called local district or heating or cooling facilities, the steam pipes that go around under a lot of cities. Things called qualified hazardous waste facilities, a number of transportation types, called mass commuting facilities, high-speed interrail, qualified highway or surface freight facilities. And so these are things that will typically have a lot more private ownership to them than, say, your standard bus line. And then a last one, which will relate to what Patrick's going to talk about. Kind of the granddaddy of this whole category was, before 1986, there were about $50 billion of pollution control bonds issued. In the old days, just when the Clean Air Act and Water Act were passed, you could issue, in quotes, you do it through a city, but the private party pays it the money back. You could issue bonds to pay for stat gas scrubbers in power plants, sewage treatment plants for your industrial facility. That got wiped out in the 1986 Tax Act simply because there were federal budget problems, and this was such a popular thing, and Congress was desperate for a way to cut the deficit, and so they chucked out pollution control bonds. So that's what there is now, and we're wondering what things should we maybe add to this list, if we could. So next slide. Before we go to the what kinds of things might we add, which is mostly what the other panelists are going to speak about, the first question is, why are the rates lower? We said the key thing is lower rates, longer time to pay back. Well, the interest rates are lower because the bond holders don't pay federal income tax on the money they get in terms of interest payments. It's very important. And yeah, this is obvious stuff, but say a corporate bond is at 10%. So that's the 10% left-hand bar on this slide. Well, in reality, you or I do not get to keep 10%. What happens is we get our bond payment, but say we owe 30% tax on that 10% interest payment. So really, at the end of the day, all we get is 7%. There's no tax on the municipal bond or private activity bond. And so pretend the rates being offered to an investor, just to dramatize it, are 7.5%. Well, that's great. I would rather have 7.5% raw interest payment and pay no tax than get a fat 10 but end up with a measly 7. So I love that, hence it's in green. On the other hand, if my broker calls me up and says, how would you like to buy this 6.5% tax-exempt bond, I would just hang up on him because that's a bad plan. I can buy the 10% bond and end up with a better after-tax income at 7. So what this means is over-under tax-exempt bonds for same credit quality and other provisions are going to typically be 1 minus the tax rate times corporate rates. And next. Here's a little more subtle point. So it's not subtle that paying back a loan over 5 years is much harder than paying a loan back over 30 years. That's why people like 30-year house mortgages. But why is it that the maturities can be longer on private activity bonds? Well, the principal alternative, if you're doing a capital project and it may be new and risky, the principal alternative financing is likely to actually be in the bank market. And banks these days don't, even on big capital projects, really don't want to lend you money much longer than 7 years. And why is that? Well, the banks are supervised by the Fed. The Fed is extra cautious after the last financial crash. And so, by the way, are all the Federal Reserve Bank of the U.S., so are all of its colleagues, like the Bank of England. They all get together and decide how to regulate banks in Basel at the International Bank of Settlements. So the Fed and all of its buddies have now made banks hold even more expensive stockholder money in reserve against bad bank loans. So if they make a $100 million loan to your decarbonization project, they may have to have actual, 10 million out of the 100 has to come from stockholders' money safely in a piggy bank. They cannot go out and raise that. That equity is really expensive. And also now, to simplify some complex rules, they can't make you a 20-year loan on your decarbonization project based on money that Fatima and I have on deposit in our checking accounts. They're worried that our money is hot money, and if we close our checking accounts, the bank would have to call in that loan. So they have to actually go out and acquire 20-year funding to match up with the 20-year loan, which is very hard for them. So for all those reasons, the banks have really pulled in the maturities they'll offer, and thus, if you want a nice, solid life of project set of financing, it's very hard to get anymore. The tax-exempt market, that doesn't apply, and the reason is because the Fed is not in charge of what you do with your money. Individuals buy private activity bonds or tax-exempt bonds. You're not regulated by the Fed. The maturities can be whatever you and the project agree upon. Next. So, and just to reiterate, so why do lower rates and longer maturities matter? Well, let's try the two different situations. Situation one is I've got $100 million a year cash flow, and it'll be similar to the Denver project that we'll hear about later, and I want to build a $1.25 billion project. So if I can't figure out how to borrow $1.25 billion with $100 million a year, I just got to give up. So I need to raise the biggest pot of upfront money for any given income stream. The flip side of the case might be I'm going to have to borrow $1.25 million of debt, and I can get it. I know I can borrow it, but the question is, how much do I have to pay in debt service? And I want to minimize the debt service so that I'm not put at a competitive disadvantage. My decarbonization project does not look to the users ridiculously expensive compared to a dirty project. So let's look at these two examples on a chart. Fatima, if you could go next. So here's just the two cases. So here's the case that, say, looks like a transit project. I've got $100 million a year coming in. That's all I've got. The blue bar to the left, where it says 558, is a 7-year bank loan at 6%. The next one, the 600, is a 7-year bank loan, and now I've cut the rate to be the same as a municipal bond interest rate at 4%. So going from the dark blue bar to the little light blue bar, it helped me in terms of my, how much money I could raise, but not that much. What really helps is the pink bar. I still have my high interest rate, but I've been able to get a longer maturity. And finally, on the green bar where it says 1359, that was a 20-year private activity bond at 4%. So again, I just changed two variables. I went from a short thing, 7 years, at a high interest rate, 6%, and by getting both a longer term, going out to 20 years, and getting a lower interest rate, the 6% dropped to 4%. That yielded the pot of money in green, the 1359. It was bigger than my minimum, my 1.25 billion. Now I can do my project. But at either a higher interest rate or a shorter payback time, I wouldn't have been able to raise the money, and I would have to give up. Or if I was building a subway system, I'd have to cut off the last 2 stops. Next, please. So here's one that, for me as an ex-power plant developer, this is a little more the usual case. I pretty much know I can raise the money, but what I don't know is how much I'm going to have to charge for my service. Say this is a low-carbon power project. And so here, I've built my project. It's going to also cost $1.25 billion. The question is, I'm sorry, I used a mass transit project. And so here's my ticket price that I'm going to have to charge. And so my debt service per year are the bars. So if I have a 7-year bank loan at 6%, the height of the blue bar is about 225 million, and I'm going to have to charge $11 for the ticket. if I can get longer, far all the way over to the right, if I can get 20 years in a private activity bond and I only have to charge 4%, my debt service drops a lot from the tall blue bar to the little green bar. And since my ticket price is basically just, my number of tickets divided by the debt service, the debt service divided by number of tickets, all of a sudden my ticket price has dropped to $4.60. And I put a little red line here that says, well, if the ticket was more than $5, everybody will just say, forget it, I'll drive in my car and listen to NPR. But if I can get the price low enough, people will use my mass transit project. And so that's the real impact here, is I don't have to pass through so much to the users of the service. So next. And this, I think, we'll just skip over, but for those of you who are mavens of different kinds of borrowing, this is really what the little check marks, these are the places where you tend to fall into trouble in other markets. So for instance, there's a market, the public bond market, are known as 144A issuances for private projects. Unless you have investment grade ratings, you get a red X. You can't be in that market. Same with insurance companies. You can have high yield bonds if you drop way down, but you can typically only get 10 years. They hate construction risk, and they do not like single projects. They like companies. So for a whole bunch of reasons, where the red X's are, you get knocked out of these markets. On the other hand, the tax-exempt private activity bond market is happy to give you long-term. It'll charge you more for sub-investment grade, but you can still get your money. It will give you fixed rates rather than floating rates. It's fine with construction risk, and it's fine with single project risk. So it's not just exactly that the term is longer and the rates are lower. It's that the market is much more negotiable and flexible, which is kind of the outcome of not being regulated by the Fed. And next. And just by the way, it also turns out, as Patrick and I learned when getting the bill he is going to talk about scored, that's where Congress measures, or congressional staff measure, what is the likely cost to the Treasury of incentive measure. The private activity bonds typically look really, really cheap to the congressional scorers. And the bad thing is that the investors don't pay tax. So you could consider, if the investors were not buying taxable bonds and would have paid big checks in terms of tax checks to the IRS, that's now lost if they can buy the tax-exempt bonds. But good in terms of the Treasury, these are offsets. If a company is funding a decarbonization project with private activity bonds, it's deducting a smaller interest charge on its annual corporate tax filings. So smaller deduction, that means its taxes are higher. Further, if you have a project that's financed with tax-exempt bonds, say instead of writing it off over 5 years, you will instead be forced to write it off over a much longer period of time on a straight line basis. So you very much slow down your depreciation deductions. So the combination of those two things, smaller interest deductions and stretched out depreciation deductions, ends up, from a technical tax standpoint, ends up pretty much coming out even, and thus extremely low scores when Congress is looking at these types of bonds or legislation authorizing more of these types of bonds. So it's a, it's a cheap way to provide a very powerful incentive. Next. And so in conclusion, the bonds are very favorable to projects because of the longer maturities, lower rates, fixed rates. The benefits translate into more money that can be raised from the same product prices, or into raising more dollars and being more competitive. If decarbonization projects could access the PAB market, existing tax laws automatically create significant offsets, positives for the Treasury. These are a big improvement if we can get access to them for decarbonization projects and a small cost or scoring to the federal government. So thus, in an environment of scarce resources and budget cuts and program terminations, PABs may be a tool worthy of very careful examination.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a great overview, and it really shows how these financing mechanisms could be make or break for some projects, and it's a way that we can mobilize more investment in some of these projects. So our next speaker, Marla Lien, is going to walk us through the use of these private activity bonds in a particular project. Marla, please feel free to go ahead.
Good day, everyone. And yes, we are now going to go from theory to practice. Next slide, please. In front of you is an abbreviated cover page from the offering statement for the Eagle P3 private activity bonds that were issued in 2010. And these are actually can be traded on the market now. It's an abbreviated cover page because there's a lot of information on the cover page of an official statement and it wouldn't all fit. But what's important for you to see, we start at the top with Regional Transportation District, and that is the issuer. Regional Transportation District is a government. It's a political subdivision of the state of Colorado. Its enabling act is in the Colorado Revised Statutes, and it is a government issuer, the first prerequisite to a private activity bond. And you see tax-exempt private activity bonds, just what Jeff was talking about. Then Denver Transit Partners, that is the company. Denver Transit Partners was a special company formed to design, build, finance, operate, maintain the Eagle P3 project for RTD. The ratings in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see Baa3 from Moody's and BBB- from Fitch. So RTD was issuing bonds and certificates of participation at the same time frame in the A's, AAA, AA-, but in the A's. And the difference between RTD issuing debt in the A's and this company that was brand new to run the project, Denver Transit Partners, issuing debt for the first time is reflected in that rating. And it meant a difference in interest rates from RTD was issuing debt at close to the 3% range, and these bonds were issued at over 5%. And the reason is in the bolded paragraph, and I didn't bold this, it was bolded on the cover page of the official statement. It says the 2010 bonds will not constitute an indebtedness of the issuer or a multiple fiscal year obligation of the issuer. So although RTD, the government, is the issuer, it is not responsible for paying the debt. The only entity that was responsible for paying the debt, and again this is in the bolded paragraph, is funds made available from the company to RTD that would then flow back through to the bondholders. So although RTD was the public issuer, it was a brand new private corporation formed to operate this to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain this project that was the only entity responsible for the debt. And so the risk to the bondholders was much greater, and the rating therefore reflected the risk. Unlike Jeff's example, the revenue that the company was getting is what was called an availability payment from RTD to operate this project. They didn't control the ticket prices, but they could have their revenues reduced if they didn't properly operate the project. So RTD was the one that was responsible for paying the operation, but people were taking a risk on this private company that if something went wrong, there was a possibility they wouldn't get paid. Next page. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the project. Union Station is right downtown Denver for anybody that's visited the area. And the Eagle P3 project was over 30 miles of new commuter rail line that went from the western suburbs in two segments, the Northwest Electrified and the Gold Line, changing at Denver Union Station and out to the airport, and building a new commuter rail maintenance facility. So RTD had about 6 years to design, build, finance this project, build the commuter rail maintenance facility, get commuter rail cars. It had only operated light rail. It didn't have any commuter rail cars in its fleet. Get mechanics and operators trained to do that, get all the infrastructure in place, and start running under the timetable that we had under various other grants and commitments to the taxpayers and the voters. RTD really needed the private sector to come in, and they put together a consortium that had a car builder, that had operators, that had financiers, and that had design and engineer for systems and commuter rail, brought in the best and the brightest, and put that together in 6 years. So the purpose behind the P3 project, the public-private partnership, was to stand up a brand new technology and a new system for RTD in a time frame that it would have been very difficult for the public sector to do without that private expertise. And so the public-private partnership and the PAB financing were both tools, and they worked hand in hand, that allowed RTD to get that line up and running. And it is up and running now. The line to the airport is open. The Gold Line hasn't opened yet. Next slide. So to take advantage of that Section 142 that Jeff was talking about, RTD had to get its own state law passed. It had to get authority to be that conduit issuer, and at the bottom, copied from the website of the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, is what a conduit issuer is. It's municipal securities by a government, which in this case was RTD, to finance a project used by a third party, which was DTP, which was a for-profit entity, but DTP was the only entity responsible for making those debt service payments. So RTD went to the legislature in 2008 saying, we want to do this public-private partnership. We think that's the best way to get the project going, but we will have difficulty financing the project under existing laws unless we do it at a higher cost by issuing taxable debt, or unless you help us take advantage of this new Section 142 that allows certain transportation facilities to use PABs, and the legislature helped us out by passing the statute. Next slide. So the section that RTD was able to take advantage of is actually one that is for a qualified highway facility. So it's not obvious right away how we were able to do this, but a qualified highway facility is one that gets any federal assistance under Title 23, which is in the United States Code, it's the highway title. But there are funds that are allowed to be flexed for transit projects under Title 23 that were put to the project. And so RTD, even though it was building a mass transit facility, a commuter rail line, was able to take advantage of this section. And there is a $15 billion cap, as Jeff talked about, in terms of cost to the Treasury. Most of the use of these private activity bonds for various kinds of activities are not unfettered. And there's a $15 billion total cap under the authorization for these qualified highway projects and surface freight transfer facilities. And one of the things we had to convince the legislature of was that we were not going to be interfering with caps for other kinds of private activity bonds that were already subscribed for things like assisted housing and other kinds of facilities. But this was a pretty new provision, and we were able to get the legislative support to take advantage of it. Next slide. So as I said earlier, we were the conduit issuer, and the statute allowed us to engage with DTP so that they could, one, finance, and this was part of their financing, the project. They were obligated on the bonds, RTD got all the proceeds of the bonds, then paid it back essentially as construction payments to DTP, who was building the project, and the balance of the payments will be made over 30 years. The project is a 34-year project, and the bondholders will get paid not out of ticket sales for the line, but a fixed price that was set on an annual basis for DTP for operating and maintaining the line as long as they live up to their contractual commitments. Next slide. And this we've been over. The risk to the bondholders when they see that government issuer is that really the government is not the one that's going to be paying them back. Next slide. So why PABs? And again, as Jeff said, it's a lower cost than taxable bonds, higher than straight government bonds where you've got the security of a government entity that is directly obligated, but lower cost than most taxable bonds. There are other techniques that are available when a government wants to make facilities that were financed by tax-free government bonds available for private use, but they have much tighter requirements. RTD had been operating some of its bus service where the buses and the stations were all built with tax-free securities, and we had been using private contractors to operate those for many years under what's called a qualified management contract, but those had more limited duration and some pretty strict parameters on how the contractor gets paid, set costs plus a fixed profit margin. This was a much more negotiated term, though that facilitated a lot more risk transfer, and the duration, 34 years total contract, was more than would have been allowed by a qualified management contract. And while the qualified management contract rules have changed, they still would not have allowed the pricing and duration components that RTD used in the Eagle project. So the private activity bonds really enabled us to deliver this public-private partnership project at the lowest cost to the taxpayer.
Thank you, Marla. That was a great overview of how government agencies can partner with the private sector and use this innovative tool to obtain access to more capital. So now that we've gone over an example of a project where this financing tool was used, now we're going to focus on some of the possibilities looking forward. And so now I will hand it over to Patrick to talk about what his boss, Senator Rob Portman, has been focusing on.
Thanks, Fatima. Yes, as both Jeff and Marla mentioned, my boss became aware of private activity bonds in the context of lowering carbon emissions, and became interested in the idea and wanted to see how we in Congress could be helpful to get specifically some carbon capture storage projects up off the ground. And so he worked with Senator Michael Bennet from Colorado, who I would imagine was aware of the transportation project in Denver. He's already had a background on PABs, and so they worked together to introduce the Carbon Capture Improvement Act, which was first introduced in late 2015. It obviously did not become law in the previous Congress, and so it was reintroduced earlier this year, and is now S-843, the Carbon Capture Improvement Act of 2017. And just a little bit of background on why specifically my boss became interested in this is because he believes that Congress should act to lower carbon emissions, but do it in a way that protects specifically his constituents in Ohio, their jobs, and the industries that provide those jobs. And if we can create jobs in the process of doing that, that's a win-win-win in his book. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll get into a little bit of the background of what the bill specifically does. As you can see, it amends Section 142 that Jeff had talked about earlier, and says that the facility's component parts that actually capture carbon will now be eligible to be financed through a PAB. It further defines what an eligible component part is, and that is a part that is integrally or functionally related to the actual act of capturing the carbon, and then it further defines what a specific facility is, and that's one that emits carbon dioxide. And it lists a few examples, but also leaves it up for further innovations. But you'll see a few of the different types of projects that could be qualifying under this bill. Next slide. Then furthermore, we lay out in the bill what the minimum threshold for capturing carbon is. And we set that at 65% or higher. So if a project captures or stores 65% of, say, a power plant's carbon emissions, then the full carbon capture component materials would be eligible for a PAB. If it's lower than 65%, we still allow the component parts in the facility to be eligible, but only up into and not above that capture limit. So let's say that a facility, a power plant, wants to install carbon capture technology, but for whatever reason, they only can capture 50% of the carbon emissions. They would only be eligible to receive and use PAB financing for up to 50% of the total cost. And then the last bullet point is pretty clear in our bill. We make the effective date for the legislation as currently drafted for December 31st of this year. So on January 1st of 2018, if this bill is signed into law before the end of the year, these facilities would be eligible for PAB financing. And like I said before, you can go to the next slide, please. My boss really comes at this for three main reasons. And Jeff mentioned some of them, but I'll briefly go over them again. But like I said before, my boss wants to reduce carbon emissions. And in order to do that, we wanted to be innovative and I don't know if it's truly innovative, though, Jeff, as you pointed out, that what's old is new again, because obviously these had been in use in the 80s and before to help power plants comply with the Clean Air Act amendments, Clean Air Act. And so we did that research, worked with Jeff and his team at the Steyer-Taylor Center and learned more about PABs and their history. But we also, in talks with industry, had heard about the high upfront cost associated with installing and designing carbon capture technology to place on whether it's power plant, steel manufacturing, cement manufacturing, fertilizer manufacturing, you name it, heavy industry that has high amounts of CO2. Each of those industries would come back to us and say, yes, we'd love to do carbon capture storage technology on our plants and reduce carbon emissions, but for the reasons that Jeff went over, they couldn't receive the financing to make it work. And so that's why we believe that PABs are so important to achieve those goals. There also is a provision in here that why we think it's important, and that's because even in a state like Ohio, where until again recently, we've seen a uptick in oil and gas development in some of the shale gas plays. We do have old existing oil wells throughout the state, just as Senator Bennett does in Colorado and throughout the country, really. But these are wells that have largely been forgotten, barely produce much oil. But if you're able to capture carbon and transport it to these old oil fields, you can then use the carbon injected into the wells and start producing higher levels of oil, which is attractive, obviously both to the industrial partners to have a market and to be able to sell the carbon, potentially that they are releasing from their operations, but also to the oil and gas producers that have the rights to these legacy wells, but cannot produce the oil that they knew was down there. And then finally, we believe that it provides energy security, and it allows our grid, power grid, in the case of coal-fired power, to stay on the grid as we transition to a lower carbon, potentially energy grid. And so this would allow, in a state like Ohio, where we have 60% of our power coming from coal-fired power generation, to keep potentially that power generation on the grid at a low cost to Ohio's consumers, and also protecting the coal production jobs that we still have in our state. And I think that's kind of reflected in our diverse group of supporters that support this legislation. We have the coal and oil companies that support this legislation, both the coal production, but also power plants operators that are very interested and would love to be able to finance carbon capture and storage technologies to retrofit some of their aging coal fleets, and even potentially new power plants, both coal and natural gas. We have the Utility Workers Union of America, so we have unions that support this. Also, we have the Building Trades Union that supports this, because they would, in the case of carbon capture, transportation would be the unions that would be building the pipelines, get the carbon to market. And then we have the NRDC, an environmental group that supports it, obviously, for the potential to reduce carbon emissions. But we also have, in the case of Ohio industries, steel manufacturers, that are very supportive of the legislation and are helping push for the legislation. We also have cement and fertilizer industries, as I had mentioned before. And not only is this bipartisan legislation in the Senate, but is also bicameral. Congressman Carlos Curbelo from Florida, a Republican from Southern Florida, and Mark Veazey, who's a Democrat from Texas, have also introduced companion legislation, identical legislation in the House. So we're hoping that now that we have legislation introduced in both houses of Congress, we can get some more movement. As Jeff had pointed out in his presentation, we feel like in the grand scheme of things, the score, as Jeff pointed out, and is important to getting any piece of legislation, but particularly tax bills passed into law, is very low. And that's important because when you're looking for offsets, it's not as hard, or you're not taking away someone else's tax incentive or tax break somewhere else in the tax code to pay for this. And so we're hopeful that we can see movement. There are, whether it's through tax reform or a potential infrastructure bill, or other must-pass legislation, my boss, Senator Bennett, and the House sponsors are continually looking for vehicles, legislation that's moving, and hopefully likely to make it to the president's desk to be signed into law. But this is a bipartisan win-win bill that we see, and we'll continue pushing on that. And I would ask all of you if you think that this is something that your communities, your companies would be interested in, that you take a look at the legislation, and reach out to your members of Congress or senators and ask them to be supportive at the right time. And happy to answer any specific questions about that. But I think that's it on my part, Fatima.
Thank you, Patrick. That was a great overview. And one thing I just want to point out is, as we were talking, it was really clear that this financing tool is relevant to so many different states. So we talked about the Eagle Project in Colorado, and Senator Bennett is a sponsor of this legislation. And you can see there's interest from Florida and Texas and Ohio. So it's really important to learn as much as we can about this tool because there will be infrastructure projects all over the country. We did have a couple questions come in, sort of just kind of clarifying questions on the Carbon Capture Improvement Act. So maybe we can start there. We are going to switch into our discussion session, but just on the topic of this bill, a question came in about whether this act would allow for these PABs to be used for negative emissions or direct atmospheric capture. Either Patrick or Jeff, if you want to answer that.
I'd have to go back and look at the definition specifically, and if it's not, it's an oversight on our part. Whoever asked that question, if you can get my contact information from Fatima or the organizers, I'd be happy to take a closer look and see if that's something that we need to specifically address.
Yeah, Patrick, this is Jeff, and I would add, those are two kind of different things. So if you have a biomass power plant, which I've financed a bunch of, a wood waste power plant, part one is people would often say that it's more or less carbon neutral because you grow poplar trees, on land that didn't have trees. They grow up, they take CO2 out of the air, you cut them down, you burn them, it puts CO2 back into the air, but at least it's a round trip, so you could call that carbon negative. This bill would certainly allow you to do what a lot of people have suggested, which is put a carbon capture unit onto that biomass power plant, which then would actually capture the CO2 released from burning and then put that in the ground. So that would give you negative emissions. What probably may not get captured is actually direct air capture, because the bill's framed in terms of someone who takes a facility that is polluting or would otherwise pollute and now captures the carbon. But since if you just wander around to the atmosphere and you have no industrial facility at all and you're just directly grabbing carbon out of the atmosphere, that probably didn't get captured in the statute. On the other hand, none of those work yet. So.
Thank you, Jeff. That was really helpful. And there is also another question about the eligibility. And the question is, does the bill have a floor, a minimum, for a particular project in terms of either tons per year captured or number of dollars financed through private activity bonds? So I've moved back to the slide where we talk about the project must capture and store 65% and above. I know that's one kind of floor, but I don't know, Jeff or Patrick, if you have anything to add in terms of any other floors in the bill.
Yeah, I don't know, Jeff, if the code has any, that specific part of the code, but our bill, as this slide kind of points out, to get full financing needs at least 65%, but they still would be eligible if they're under that threshold. And there is no, it has to capture or store 1 million tons per year, let's say, or whatever. There's no minimum on the total amount of raw carbon captured. It's only on the percentage of the total carbon captured. But I don't know specifically of the code, Jeff, if there's anything in there that addresses that.
You're dead right. It's based on the efficacy of the facility. In other words, if you were emitting 10 tons, now you install this equipment and you only are emitting 2 tons, you've captured 80%, you're good. If on the other hand, you were emitting 10 billion tons a year, 10 billion, and you install equipment and now you're only emitting 2 billion, you're good there too. What we care about is that these type of provisions are designed so that you don't build some enormous facility, and you were formerly emitting 10 billion tons a year, and now, you're emitting 9,999,000. What you care about is sort of the efficacy of the facility in terms of reduction of CO2, not the absolute amount.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So now let's go ahead and broaden our conversation a little bit and talk about private activity bonds generally. There was a question about whether U.S. companies can use private activity bonds as a finance tool for international projects. And I think that the answer is no, but let me just throw that out there in case I'm wrong. Okay, I think they basically can only be used by for U.S. projects because you would need a U.S. state or local agency to issue them. There's another question about, so the first question on the slide here is what kinds of low carbon emission infrastructure projects would be a good fit for PABs? And someone also wrote in and said, do you have any thoughts on how we can finance adaptation projects like building cool streets, increasing tree canopy, protecting infrastructure from sea level rise? So could you talk generally, this is a question for all of the panelists, about what kinds of projects would be a good fit for these financing tools?
This is Jeff. I could dive in on that one, which is quickly, if you're doing things like, say, improving streets or, say, adding seawalls to protect your town from inundation, those would typically be projects that you could do as just a straight ordinary government infrastructure project, so you wouldn't need private activity bonds, right? You would certainly use tax-exempt bonds, but they would likely to be just a normal project of your local government. So, where the private part comes in, the reason that you need this special blessing from Congress is basically if either the facility, if the proceeds, the money from the bond issue is being used to buy equipment that's used by private parties, not by government, then you get into problems unless you have private activity bond authorization for the particular kind of equipment. Or say, as in Marla's case, if the proceeds of a bond goes to build something and generally, say, the public's using it, like her commuter rail riders, that's all good. But sometimes if the project is getting managed under a very long-term management contract with a private party, then to the tax guys, it really looks, in a sense, like the project's being built for the benefit of the private party that's managing it so that they can make a profit. So that would also get you into trouble. So it's in those kinds of situations only that you really need private activity bonds. Again, if you're just building a seawall to protect yourself from floods like Hurricane Sandy, that's a straight up government infrastructure project. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. That was helpful. Then the next question I kind of wanted to open up was how can the federal government support broader use of the PABs? And so, Patrick, you talked about a bill that is being considered in Congress. Do you have any other additional thoughts on this second question?
Sure. Yeah. This is our bill is a start, but as we heard on the call, and there are certainly other ways that, specifically, I think if our legislation does get signed into law and enacted, and it does really move the needle and helps projects get started, while not costing the federal government a lot of money in terms of revenue that is coming into the Treasury, that helps build momentum to further expand PABs to other types of activities that would also achieve similar goals. So as with anything in politics, I think positive results makes it easier to go back and go back to our colleagues here in the House and Senate and tell them, hey, we have this great story to tell, that it's been helpful, and I think the Denver project is a great example as that continues to hopefully meet the goals that they set out for and provide to the people of Denver, that it makes it easier to come to Congress and ask for similar authorities. So it takes time, but I think good results will lead to even more action on PABs.
Thank you. That's a really great perspective. And then maybe we can address these last two questions together. What should states and cities and the bondholders be aware of if they're going to use these PABs for projects? And maybe that's a good question for Marla, since you worked on a project in the past, but it's also open to all of the panelists.
I would say that those are flip sides of the same coin. And as I talked about with that bold notice on the front of the official statement, I think cities and states and bondholders need to be aware of who they're really dealing with and the security that they're getting. So although it looks on its face right up at the very top like you're getting the pledge of a government entity because that is the issuer, and typically the issuer is the one that's the payer, that's not the case with private activity bonds. And so cities and states have to make sure that the public, the bondholders, the buyers understand that they are not buying an absolute pledge of the city and state. It is a project that is probably not going to be taken offline because this is a public project. So there has been at a governmental level a decision that we need to have this project. And that is some additional security over maybe a corporate facility. But the bondholders have to understand that although it's a government-sponsored project and the government feels like the taxpayers, the public, obviously need this project and they're putting up some money, some backing for this project, the security that they are relying on as a private operator.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And I think that answers a question that also came in about whether these tend to be higher risk investments. And I guess the answer is there is a risk that the repayment will not happen. And so these parties, states, cities, and the bondholders should all be aware of that.
Hey, Fatima, add one thing to that.
Yeah.
This is a very tricky thing to understand, but in general, whether you're a private activity bond, say, or a corporate bond for a project, that per se has no impact on your credit. So to take, for example, the bonds that were issued for pollution control, and many of which have been rolled over and refinanced many times. Take an entity like Pacificorp, big utility holding company. When it issues its bonds, regular old utility taxable bonds, I can't remember Pacificorp's current rating, but probably a single A. They also would issue pollution control bonds, exactly the same corporate credit. Pacificorp is pledging to pay back those pollution control private activity bonds. It's still a single A. There's no impact on the credit whatsoever. The only thing that's weird looking is a Pacificorp bond that they issue directly. You can go look it up on the SEC's website. It's just an SEC registered bond. When they issue a bond, or become indebted on a bond that's exactly the same credit, but for a pollution control facility, there'll be something like, Carbon County, Wyoming Pollution Control Board is the official municipal issuer, which, it's basically, say, a small subsidiary of the Carbon County Commission or the Board of Commissioners. They just allow the bonds to be issued. Literally, the bonds are sold. Money immediately goes to Pacificorp, and the sole repayment is money coming in from Pacificorp. Carbon County basically never touches it again. But so it's a different label on the security and a weird routing to get it issued because it's nominally issued through Carbon County, Wyoming, but at the end of the day, it's exactly the same credit. And that's why this whole conduit issuer thing is a little confusing. It's just there's no mechanism for a company to go out and issue a tax-exempt bond because it's a company, not a government. So at some point, a government has to have their hands on it, but it may be only for a nanosecond.
Jeff, so point being, it's the same credit as the private company, but not the same credit as the government.
Correct. And usually the government has almost nothing to do with it other than standing in to be the issuer for the first nanosecond and, signing the documents.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that might be a good place to end the conversation. I did get a couple of other additional detailed questions, and I will see if we can find a way to respond to the folks asking the questions directly. But I want to thank the panelists for sharing their expertise with all of us, and I want to thank the attendees for making time to dial in and learn more about this important tool. So with that, thank you for dialing in, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.